Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we dive into one of the most overlooked and misunderstood wars of the 20th century, the Chaco War. A brutal conflict between Bolivia and Paraguay that wasn't just about borders, it was about pride, oil, and the ghosts of colonialism. But here's the twist. What if I told you that tens of thousands died fighting over land that turned out to be practically worthless? That this war, waged in sweltering deserts and tangled forests, was built on illusion more than fact? Let's start with the historical backdrop, because before any shots were fired, the seeds of conflict were already buried deep in the soil of the past. After the War of the Pacific in the late 1800s, Bolivia lost something crucial: its coastline. Imagine being a country suddenly cut off from ocean trade, surrounded by mountains and rivals. Bolivia became landlocked, and with that came a gnawing sense of isolation. Every trade negotiation, every export or import, became a logistical nightmare. So, when whispers spread of oil lying beneath the Chaco Boreal, a vast and contested wilderness to the southeast, it wasn't just curiosity that drove Bolivia's interest. It was desperation. A lifeline to global markets might lie buried in that soil. And what about Paraguay? Paraguay was still reeling from the cataclysmic Triple Alliance War that had ended over 50 years earlier. That war had nearly erased the country from the map. Most of its male population was wiped out. By the early 1900s, Paraguay was a wounded nation trying to rebuild itself from ashes. The Chaco wasn't just land, it was survival. Access to resources, trade routes, and national dignity were all at stake. And then came the real accelerant: oil speculation. Companies like Standard Oil and Royal Dutch Shell dangled dreams of untapped wealth like a carrot on a stick. No one had confirmed the existence of oil in the Chaco, but that didn't stop the hype. Politicians started seeing black gold in their future budgets. The region became a geopolitical poker game, with foreign corporations placing heavy bets. Finally, we can't ignore the deep scars of colonialism. When European powers left South America, they didn't clean up after themselves. Borders were vague, maps were often contradictory, and old rivalry simmered just beneath the surface. Combine that with surging nationalism and a hunger to reclaim past glories, and you've got a volatile brew. So here we are, two struggling nations, fueled by national trauma and economic insecurity, both convinced that controlling the Chaco was the key to their future. But was it? Stick around, because what came next reveals just how powerful myths, corporations, and desperation can be when they collide on the battlefield. Now let's pull back the curtain on a powerful but often hidden force in the Chaco War: the foreign corporations. You see, while Bolivia and Paraguay were marching their young men to the front lines, there were boardrooms in New York and London buzzing with their own kind of battle plans, only theirs weren't drawn in blood. They were drawn in barrels. Oil barrels. Standard Oil, one of the most dominant American companies of the era, threw its weight behind Bolivia. Meanwhile, Royal Dutch Shell, with its global reach and deep European ties, was seen as backing Paraguay. But this wasn't just a game of corporate cheerleading. These companies had real influence over national policy. Here's why that matters. Oil speculation wasn't simply a background rumor. It became a strategic goal. Governments started making decisions not based on what was confirmed, but on what was hoped. The Chaco was viewed as the next big oil frontier, even though no one had extracted a single meaningful drop. But the promise? Oh, it was intoxicating. Territorial claims were no longer just about land. They were about securing investment. Think about that. Countries mobilized armies not because they needed the Chaco immediately, but because foreign capital might flow in if they controlled it. Investment-driven war. That's a dangerous game. And let's talk about perception versus reality. The mobilization, this entire military buildup, was based more on imagined potential than proven resources. Governments were gambling. And the soldiers? They were the chips being pushed across the table. What's worse, these corporations didn't just passively observe the chaos, they actively exploited it. They knew these nations were vulnerable, fractured, and desperate, and they saw opportunity in that desperation. Monopoly prospects, pipeline dreams. National insecurity became a tool to be leveraged. It's easy to point fingers at governments in retrospect, but what happens when policymaking is shaped not by data or diplomacy, but by corporate lobbying and foreign influence? This wasn't just a regional squabble, it was a puppet show, and the strings reached all the way into the global oil economy. Next, we'll see the human cost of that economic theater. Spoiler alert, it wasn't paid in dollars, it was paid in lives. Now that we've followed the money, let's follow the people, the ones who actually fought and died in the Chaco War. Because beneath the oil speculation, beneath the diplomatic maneuvering, this was a war fought by the poor. Not by generals, not by executives, not by foreign investors, by peasants. Over 100,000 men were conscripted by each side. Think about that: rural farmers, many of them illiterate, most of them completely untrained, suddenly thrown into one of the harshest environments on earth under the flag of patriotism. But was it really nationalism? Or was it desperation dressed in a uniform? Governments needed manpower, and when you don't have volunteers, you manufacture them. Through rhetoric, through propaganda, through fear, people were told they were defending their homeland, but in reality, they were pawns in a much larger and more cynical game. The enemy wasn't always across the trench. It was often in the capital, directing strategy from afar with clean hands. And here's where it gets tragic. Over 100,000 deaths occurred during this war, but most of them didn't die from bullets or bombs. They died from thirst, from heat stroke, from disease, from malnutrition. The Chaco region was a natural furnace, remote, barren, merciless. Imagine being marched into that desert with a rifle and no boots that fit. That was reality. The suffering wasn't a side effect. It was built in. To keep things under control, both Bolivia and Paraguay resorted to centralized authority. They rationed basic supplies. They censored news. They made sure the only story anyone heard was the one they wanted them to believe. No dissent, no debate, just obedience. And all the while, the real problems, resource scarcity, national insecurity, foreign manipulation, were being masked by the illusion of unity and heroism. The poor fought the war, the poor died in the war, and the poor were never meant to benefit from the war. This wasn't a noble struggle for independence. This was centralized militarism at its most brutal, where decisions made by a few destroyed the lives of thousands. But what did those thousands die for? That's the question we'll face next. So, what was waiting at the end of all that suffering? Surely, after all the bloodshed, after the speeches and the sacrifices, there must have been something of value in the Chaco, right? Wrong. Once the war ended, geologists and surveyors finally had the chance to properly examine the region. And what did they find? Practically nothing. The great oil boom that everyone was chasing was a mirage. The land was bone dry in every sense of the word. There were no vast oil reserves, no underground rivers of wealth, just more sand, more heat, and more regret. The war's entire rationale collapsed under the weight of reality. Paraguay technically won the war. It gained the disputed territory. But let's not pretend that was a victory. The cost was devastating. Economically, the country was crippled. Demographically, it was hollowed out. Thousands of young men were dead. Families were broken. Infrastructure was shattered. It was a classic Pyrrhic victory, where winning meant almost nothing compared to what was lost. And what about Bolivia? The loss didn't just end on the battlefield. It spiraled into political chaos. The humiliation, the economic strain, the death toll, it all added fuel to a fire that finally exploded into revolution in 1952. A war they were told was necessary ended up destabilizing their entire political system. And hovering over all of this was the uncomfortable truth. The war had been driven by myth, a belief in resources that didn't exist, a belief that conquest would solve deep, systemic problems, a belief that power could substitute for truth, and perhaps worst of all, that belief prevented peace. Leaders on both sides were so invested in the fantasy that they couldn't even consider negotiation. Once the myth takes hold, logic doesn't stand a chance. So now we ask, what would have happened if the truth had been known earlier? How many lives could have been spared? How many futures saved? The answer is sobering, but it also opens the door to one final lesson, a question of systems, of decision-making, and of how power gets used. That's where we're headed next. Now that we've seen the wreckage, it's time to ask a deeper question, not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did. And here's where things get uncomfortable, because this wasn't just a story of bad luck or poor maps. This was a failure of systems, a failure rooted in the way decisions were made, and who got to make them. Let's talk about centralization. In both Bolivia and Paraguay, power was heavily concentrated. Decisions about war, conscription, supply lines, and diplomacy were made by a handful of men, far removed from the front lines, far removed from the consequences. These elites had the ability to send entire populations into conflict without debate, without transparency, and without accountability. And when all decisions flow from the top, what happens to the people at the bottom? They get ignored. The needs of civilians, the voices of rural communities, the skepticism of local leaders, all of it was silenced in the name of national unity. But unity, in this case, was just another word for control. Now imagine an alternative. What if these nations had decentralized systems? What if local communities had more say over whether their sons went to war? What if regional leaders could challenge national propaganda with facts on the ground? What if decision-making wasn't locked in a room but distributed across a network of people with skin in the game? Would the war have happened at all? Maybe not, or maybe it would have ended sooner. Either way, decentralization introduces friction, and friction can be a good thing when the engine of war is starting to roar. You see, when power is concentrated, it tends to accelerate. There are fewer breaks, fewer checkpoints, fewer dissenting voices to say, wait, do we even know there's oil here? In a decentralized system, bad ideas die faster. They get tested earlier, they get exposed before they metastasize into national catastrophes. So the lesson here isn't just about Paraguay and Bolivia. It's about how any nation, any system, handles power, truth, and decision-making. Because the more centralized a government becomes, the easier it is to start a war, and the harder it becomes to stop one. And that brings us to our final thoughts, where we take everything we've learned and ask the most important question of all. What now? So here we are, after 6 brutal years of fighting, over 100,000 lives lost, and an entire generation scarred. What was it all for? The Chaco War wasn't fought over clear evidence. It wasn't fought over verified resources. It wasn't even fought over immediate threats. It was fought over belief, over maps drawn in speculation, over whispered rumors of oil that no one had actually seen. And when belief becomes policy, when fantasy overrides fact, that's when history becomes tragedy. This war reminds us that sometimes, the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a bomb. It's unchecked certainty. It's the blind conviction of leaders who refuse to question their own assumptions. It's a system so centralized, so insulated, that it can't hear the people it claims to represent. But it also reminds us of something else, something more hopeful. That history doesn't have to repeat itself. That truth, transparency, and shared power aren't just moral ideals. They are safeguards. When power is questioned, when facts are verified, when communities are empowered to speak, wars like this one become harder to start. And isn't that the real lesson? That dignity is worth more than oil. That cooperation is stronger than conquest. And that every soldier buried in the Chaco deserved a future that never came, because someone else believed in a lie. If you found this story powerful, please like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. Your support helps us keep exploring the stories that shape the world and the systems that continue to shape our lives. And if you want to hear the podcast version of this episode, you'll find the link in the description. There's so much more to uncover, so if you enjoy thoughtful and entertaining history that goes beyond the surface, check out the other videos on the channel. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding why it happened and making sure we never make the same mistake twice.